You don't need more motivation. That's the lie we've been sold. That if you could just want it bad enough, you'd finally break through. But what if the real reason you're stuck is that you've never learned how to act when you don't want it? Jake thought he was ambitious. Every January, he made a plan. Every Monday, he said, "This is the week." And every time, by Friday, he had already broken his word to himself. Sound familiar? Most people think they're one habit away from success. One new side hustle, one perfect morning routine. But here's the truth. None of that works if you still let your feelings run your life. Jake learned that the hard way. He had to lose something big before he understood what was really keeping him stuck. I'll tell you what happened. But first, let's talk about you. Most people fail not because they don't dream big enough, but because they can't make themselves act when it matters most. They wait for motivation, for the perfect moment, for some magical sign that never comes. And while they wait, their potential rots quietly in the background. Jake used to be one of them. He had big plans. Every Sunday night he'd write them out. New business ideas, gym goals, habits to build. He felt unstoppable. Until Tuesday. That's when the emotional high wore off. That's when the real war began. The silent war between who he was and who he said he wanted to be. He always lost. What Jake didn't know is what keeps most people stuck. It's not laziness. It's not fear of failure. It's the belief that you need to feel ready in order to act. And that belief is a trap. One that buries more dreams than any lack of talent ever could. But there's something else, something even more dangerous that almost no one talks about. And it's exactly where this all turns. Right before Jake hit rock bottom, he discovered a pattern. A behavior so subtle, yet so destructive, that once you see it, you can't unsee it. I'll show you what it is in a minute. But if you've ever felt like you're doing everything right and still going nowhere, this might be the reason. Don't blink. What's coming could change the way you approach every goal you've ever had. But first, you need to meet the real Jake. Not the version he posted online, the one he avoided in the mirror. Jake wasn't lazy. He wasn't careless. He was smart, articulate, the kind of guy you'd expect to win. Eventually. But that was the problem. Everything in Jake's life was about eventually. He had a folder full of plans, side hustles he'd start when work calmed down, books he'd read once he had time, gym memberships that expired unused. In theory, Jake was unstoppable. In reality, he couldn't even stop hitting snooze. He lived in a loop, inspired on Sunday, defeated by Wednesday, regretful by Friday. Then the next week came, and the cycle restarted. And every time it happened, Jake lost a little more trust in himself. Not because he was failing, but because deep down, he knew he wasn't even trying long enough to call it failure. He just stopped. The worst part wasn't the lack of results. It was the quiet shame. The kind that builds up slowly until your dreams start to sound like lies. Jake avoided mirrors not because of how he looked, but because they reminded him of what he hadn't done. He wasn't stuck because life was hard. He was stuck because he'd built a habit of quitting the moment it got hard. But there's one specific moment that changed everything. A breaking point. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just painfully ordinary. Yet it exposed the exact mental trap that keeps millions frozen in the same place for years. I'll get to that moment soon. First, let's talk about the silent enemy Jake never saw coming. Jake thought he had a motivation problem. That if he could just feel inspired enough, focused enough, ready enough, then he'd finally follow through. But that assumption was the trap, because he believed the action should feel good. And the moment it didn't, he questioned the path. That's how he stayed in motion, without ever moving forward. What Jake was really dealing with was something much deeper: the unconscious addiction to emotional alignment. In simple terms, he only acted when it felt right. But growth rarely feels right. It feels uncertain, heavy, lonely. So every time the discomfort came, the early mornings, the silence, the delayed gratification, he interpreted it as a sign to stop. This wasn't just procrastination. It was a neurological habit. His brain had learned that short-term relief, skipping the task, avoiding the call, shelving the project, was more immediately rewarding than long-term achievement. And like any habit, it reinforced itself. Over time, quitting became Jake's comfort zone. And here's the dangerous part. The world rewarded his appearance of effort. He'd get likes for announcing goals, praise for potential, empathy for burnout, but none of it translated into progress. His life became a loop of impressive beginnings and invisible endings. But something snapped the day he looked at his calendar and realized he had 17 unfinished ideas in the past year alone. Not one completed, not one followed to the point of pain and breakthrough. That was the moment he stopped blaming his circumstances and started questioning his identity. Still, identifying the enemy wasn't enough. Jake needed a way to fight it, a weapon against that internal resistance. What he found next would reshape how he approached everything. But it didn't start with motivation. It started with something far less exciting and far more powerful. We'll get to that, but only after you see what Jake almost gave up right before the shift. It was a Thursday night. Jake sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at the login screen of a project he had once been obsessed with. A podcast he'd planned for months. He had the equipment. He had the notes. He even had a few episodes recorded, but he hadn't uploaded a single one. Why? Because he didn't think it was good enough yet. That phrase, good enough yet, had become his shield and his prison. He hovered over the delete button, not because the project had failed, but because it hadn't exploded fast enough. No viral growth, no instant feedback, no dopamine. In that moment, Jake didn't just feel disappointment. He felt exposed, because for once, there was no one else to blame. Then something strange happened. Before he could shut the laptop, he opened a file he had forgotten existed. It was a voice memo from the first night he'd recorded. Raw, clumsy, but honest. In it, he said, "This isn't about going viral. It's about keeping a promise to myself." He had said it, he had meant it, but he had forgotten it the moment things got hard. That line hit him harder than any motivational quote ever could. Because it revealed the core issue. Jake had built an identity around starting, not finishing. He wore ambition like a badge, but never paid the price of perseverance. And that realization shattered him. But here's the turning point, the part that most people skip. Jake didn't get up and grind harder the next day. He didn't suddenly wake up at 5 a.m. or drink celery juice or read 5 books a week. He did something far more uncomfortable. He admitted he couldn't trust his feelings. And from that moment, he stopped trying to force motivation. He started designing systems that could operate without it. Now, systems aren't sexy. They're not the stuff of viral reels or dopamine hits, but they are the reason some people execute relentlessly while others stay stuck in a loop of someday. And Jake's system? It began with one brutally honest question, the kind most people avoid because of what it might reveal. I'll share it with you next. But be warned, once you hear it, you can't unhear it. The question was simple, but it broke something open inside Jake. What would my life look like if I only acted when I felt like it? He didn't need a coach to answer it. He just had to look around, at the unread books, the unopened files, the fading dreams taped to his fridge. That was the life built on feelings, unstable, inconsistent, and always starting over. So he flipped the equation. Instead of waiting for emotion to fuel action, he built a structure where action triggered emotion. This was the beginning of his system, and it started small, absurdly small. A single rule: every morning, the podcast file had to be open by 7 a.m. Whether he edited for 5 minutes or 50 didn't matter. The win was showing up. That one rule rewired something, because it didn't depend on mood. It didn't ask for inspiration. It just ran, like brushing your teeth, like locking your door. Automatic, predictable. But here's the twist most people miss. Jake didn't trust himself yet. So he didn't rely on willpower. He relied on friction. He deleted apps from his phone, put his microphone next to his coffee mug. He designed his environment to leave him no choice but to follow through. And slowly, something radical happened. He started finishing. Not because he felt powerful, but because he stopped negotiating with weakness. His identity shifted from the guy with ideas to the guy who delivers. And that shift wasn't loud. It wasn't public. It was internal. The kind of shift that doesn't impress anyone else, but changes everything for you. But this is where most people quit. They start building systems, and then boredom hits. And what they don't realize is that boredom is the signal that it's working. Jake almost fell into that trap again, until a conversation with someone who had quietly built a fortune without ever feeling motivated gave him the missing piece. That conversation reframed everything, and it's exactly what we'll unpack next. But first, ask yourself, are you building systems or just stacking intentions? Jake met Kevin during a conference break. Nothing flashy, just two guys with coffee and silence between sessions. Kevin didn't look successful, wore a plain hoodie, checked a basic flip phone. But when Jake asked what he did, Kevin's answer was quiet and disarming. I help companies automate their cash flow systems. Nothing exciting, but it works. What struck Jake wasn't what Kevin did. It was how he said it, like someone who didn't need to prove anything. They talked for 15 minutes. Jake shared his struggles, his bursts of energy, his burnout cycles. Kevin just listened. Then, without drama, he said, "I used to be like that. Until I stopped trusting motivation and started tracking repetition." That phrase hit like a cold shower. Tracking repetition. Jake had spent years chasing emotional spikes. Kevin had spent years repeating basic systems. While Jake perfected planning tools, Kevin executed routines. While Jake waited for clarity, Kevin measured consistency. One built momentum, the other built excuses. Kevin explained his system like it was nothing. 3 rules: fixed inputs, minimal variables, weekly audits. If something breaks, I tweak the process, not my identity. He used checklists, timers, and environmental cues. Not because he was weak, but because he refused to gamble his future on how he felt each day. And then he said something Jake never forgot. People think discipline is hard, but it's actually a relief. Once you surrender the illusion of freedom, you're free to build a life that works. That idea, surrendering the illusion of freedom, haunted Jake. Because he realized most of his life was designed around comfort, not outcome. He'd convinced himself that freedom meant options. But Kevin had shown him the opposite. Freedom came from constraints, from eliminating decision fatigue, from choosing once and letting systems do the rest. This wasn't just about productivity. It was about peace. Jake saw for the first time that the most successful people didn't grind harder. They designed environments that made success feel inevitable. But that raised a new question, one that would define how Jake approached everything going forward. What if the life you want isn't built by doing more, but by doing fewer things with ruthless consistency? That's what we'll break down next. The architecture of sustainable execution. Because most people fail not for lack of ambition, but because their systems collapse under pressure. Let's fix that. Jake didn't need more goals. He had dozens. What he lacked was an operating system, a repeatable structure that made progress automatic, not emotional. Kevin had one, so Jake started building his own, brick by brick, with one rule in mind. Nothing vague survives friction. The first piece was the trigger. Every system begins with a signal, a time, a place, a cue. Jake chose mornings right after coffee. Same spot, same action, no negotiation. This removed the first and most dangerous variable, decision-making. The more choices he had, the more likely he was to stall. So he erased the choice. Next came the process. Jake broke every goal into micro steps, not just tasks. He didn't say, record an episode. He said, open editing software, review outline, hit record for 5 minutes. Why? Because specific steps dissolve resistance. Ambiguity is where self-doubt thrives. Precision kills it. Then came tracking. Jake didn't track outcomes. He tracked execution. Did the action happen? Yes or no? He used a single spreadsheet. No colors, no hacks, just brutal honesty. And every Sunday, he asked, where did the system break? Not what went wrong, but what can be restructured. He didn't see failure as personal. He saw it as mechanical. If a system failed, it meant the design was weak, not the person. Over time, Jake noticed something unsettling. He didn't feel more motivated. He actually felt less. But his results grew. Because he wasn't chasing feelings anymore. He was operating above them. The structure was holding, even on the days he didn't. And that's when it hit him. Discipline wasn't a character trait. It was a design decision. But this kind of execution has a hidden cost. One most people ignore. As you rise, you outgrow parts of your life that can't come with you. Friends, routines, even relationships. Jake was about to learn that building discipline isn't just about doing hard things. It's about having hard conversations. And the next one nearly pulled him back into the version of himself he thought he'd left behind. As Jake's system started to solidify, his results spoke louder than any Instagram post ever could. Clients returned his calls. His audience slowly grew. His body leaned out. But with each gain, a quiet loss began to echo. One that had nothing to do with money or metrics. The people closest to him didn't understand the shift, and some began to resist it. It started subtly. A friend mocking his routines, a partner questioning why he worked on weekends. The jokes carried weight. You're obsessed. You're not fun anymore. At first, Jake laughed it off, but inside, he felt the sting of isolation, because part of him still craved approval, still feared rejection, still wondered if he was becoming too different. This is the cost most never talk about. The emotional friction of identity change. When you evolve, you disturb the equilibrium of your environment. And if those around you aren't evolving too, they'll unconsciously pull you back. Not out of malice, out of fear, because your growth reminds them of what they're avoiding. Jake reached his breaking point during a dinner with his oldest friend. He shared an idea for a new business model, a result of months of research. The response? You're always chasing something. Maybe you should slow down and just be grateful. It was a dagger disguised as concern, and Jake felt the familiar urge to shrink, to stay likable, to stay small. But this time, he didn't. He didn't argue or defend. He simply said, "I'm not chasing anything. I'm building something. And I've learned I don't need everyone to clap for it." That conversation marked a new layer of discipline. Not in action, but in identity. The ability to stay committed to your evolution, even when it threatens your belonging. Jake realized that true transformation demands detachment, not from people, but from the version of yourself they're attached to. But discipline without emotional clarity can still crack under pressure. That's why Jake started doing something most high performers ignore: a weekly reset that anchored not just his habits, but his mind. And it's that ritual, deceptively simple, but quietly powerful, that gave his systems the longevity most people only dream about. We'll end with that. If you don't watch the next video on your screen, you won't understand how money actually works. You'll keep chasing tactics, ignoring the mindset that controls it all. Discipline, focus, financial clarity, that's what we build here. Subscribe now. Like the video. And whatever you do, don't skip what comes next. Because that video, it's where everything starts to click.